Returning now to the Iranian election and the question of how Rouhani's victory will likely affect Tehran's nuclear policies. Joining us from our Tel Aviv studio is arms control expert Professor Emily Landau of Tel Aviv University's Institute for National Studies. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Landau.
My pleasure.
First, I'd like to ask you a question for your reaction to Hassan Rouhani's election.
I think this could be good news for the Iranian people, or at least better news than one of the other candidates if they had been elected. This is a candidate who has aligned himself with the goals of the reformist movement. He's not himself a reformist, but he definitely has embraced some of the major tenets of this movement. And therefore, we know that the president can be more influential as far as internal policy is concerned. And therefore, for the Iranian people, there might be some good news on the horizon, although it remains to be seen. As far as foreign policy is concerned, we know very well that this is directed by the Supreme Leader, Khamenei, and there's not much reason to believe that the change of president will bring any change in that regard, especially as Rowhani himself is very much a part of the Islamic regime. He's not an opponent to this regime, quite the opposite. He's a staunch supporter of the regime, and therefore I don't expect to see any opposition on his part to the basic goals of this regime.
Rouhani used to head Iran's nuclear negotiating team. Is he likely to alter Tehran's strategic positions?
When he headed the nuclear negotiations, what we saw was a different tactic on the part of Iran. But there was no difference in terms of the essence of pushing Iran's nuclear program forward. What Rouhani was worried about at the time was not to suffer high costs for the nuclear program. He did not want it to be referred to the Security Council, and therefore he was a little bit more forthcoming as far as cooperative face in the negotiation setting. However, not much was achieved in essence even when Rouhani was running things. And he's on record after he stepped down from this post in later in the year of 2005, he's on record saying basically that the purpose of this negotiation with the Europeans was to buy time in order to push the nuclear program forward and to avoid costs.
Professor Landau, do you think those advocating an attack on Iran's nuclear sites have been dealt a setback? Will his election, in fact, undermine support for a potential Israeli military strike against the hardline Islamic Republic?
Look, I think that the overall, process of dealing with Iran on the nuclear issue might become more difficult, actually, or maybe ironically, with Rouhani, because, as I said, the basic interest is not likely to change. Iran is on its way to achieving a military nuclear power. That's where it's going in the nuclear realm. But when you have a president and perhaps a new nuclear negotiator that seems to be more cooperative, this will only enhance Iran's ability to successfully use the tactic of playing for time, because the international community will be sure that he's ready for cooperation. This is someone they can deal with. More time will go by, and unfortunately we're at a very late stage. Iran is very close to its goal, and it's very close to creating a fait accompli basically in the nuclear realm, and that's the worry with regard to Rouhani.
How, to the best of your knowledge, Professor Landau, how close then is Iran to acquiring nuclear weapons?
I think the question is not, the United States has put the onus on the issue of the decision. Has Iran made a decision to go for nuclear weapons? I prefer rather to link, the danger to whether Iran gets to the point where it has basically created an infrastructure, a nuclear infrastructure that is spread out enough to enough nuclear facilities that are, guarded, underground, difficult to damage physically, that will basically create a fait accompli. By the way, the plutonium route We've been focused for the past decade on the uranium enrichment, but the plutonium route is also there. And the facility that's relevant to that route to the nuclear weapons is due to become operational in 2014, which will seriously undermine any military option in this regard. So when Iran creates this fait accompli, that's the danger, because from that point it will be able to move to nuclear weapons when at a time of its choosing. And that's a situation that I think the international community has a strong interest to avoid.
Professor Emily Landau of Tel Aviv University's Institute for National Security Studies, thank you so much for being our guest.
You're welcome.